Gellier were both enhancement-type mutants skilled in close combat. Perhaps it had something to do with the customs of the snowy plateau, but the men there were more enthusiastic about hand-to-hand combat. The two collided, and in an instant, they began to fight frantically. The violent sound was like thunder, making everyone watching from 1,000 meters away feel their hearts tremble. Gellier, in the form of the 8-armed Vajra, took advantage of his many arms to frantically attack Janda's vital points. However, Janda used his combat experience to dodge the attacks. His skin was like metal and had powerful defensive capabilities. As long as his vital points were not hit, any other cuts and bruises were only minor injuries. Raging Vajra was at his most powerful when he was extremely angry. The blood made Janda even more ruthless. His pitch-black arms were like 2 iron pillars, and his fists were like copper hammers, which he aimed at Gellier's head and slammed down hard. The sound of the punch was so loud that it caused a sonic boom. Gellier immediately blocked his head with 2 arms, while the other 6 arms continued to attack frantically. Boom! 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 The battlefield was filled with thunderous sounds. Their bodies were huge, but their movements were not slow at all. On the contrary, they were extremely agile. Even Zhang Yi had to use his ability to accelerate space and enhance his dynamic capture ability in order to see their movements. When he saw the battle between the two clearly, Zhang Yi couldn't help but gasp. From the beginning, the two didn't hold back at all, fighting with their lives on the line. Gellier's weapon slashed fiercely at Janda's body. Janda's eyes were bloodshot, and he only dodged the vital attacks, his fists like 2 copper hammers, aimed at Gellier's head and chest. The battlefield was filled with the sound of fists hitting flesh and the angry roars of the two men, causing many of the private soldiers to turn pale. The clan chiefs of both sides looked solemnly at the center of the battlefield, praying in their hearts that their warriors would quickly kill their opponents. After watching for a while, Zhang Yi felt that something was wrong with Janda. In terms of strength, Janda had the upper hand. But the other guy had 8 hands, while he only had 2, which meant that his attacks would always be blocked by his opponent. But he found it difficult to block his opponent's attacks. That guy is very smart, Zhang Yi commented lightly. Liang Yu glanced at Zhang Yi and said, "He's just being clever." "Oh?" Zhang Yi looked at her curiously. Liang Yu said, "Why are humans born with 2 arms? Wouldn't it be easier to do things with more arms? It's not just humans, lions, tigers, elk, and horses all have 4 limbs. It's not that more arms and legs are better. Heaven gave us 4 limbs because it's the most harmonious proportion." Upon hearing this, Zhang Yi carefully observed the fighting style of Gellier, and sure enough, he found that his movements were not coordinated. With 8 arms, it was impossible to use all of them at full strength, and they would burden each other and disperse his power. Zhang Yi smiled faintly. "It is indeed clever." But he quickly stopped smiling and said, "However, clever tricks are also useful." Gellier understood his abilities better than anyone else, so he naturally knew that it was impossible to use all 8 arms at full strength. Therefore, he coordinated his arms very well, using his 2 original arms to wrestle with Janda and withstand his barrage of attacks head-on. The other arms were secretly striking Janda's body from below, leaving wounds. Janda's body was as strong as steel, but he was not without weaknesses. Gellier focused his attacks on Janda's groin. This seemed despicable, but in actual combat, as long as one could kill the opponent, anything was acceptable. Even among the martial arts moves that Liang Yu taught Zhang Yi, many of the killing moves were aimed at the lower body. It sounded bad, but it was really effective. Janda's face suddenly turned ugly. As a man, that was definitely his most vulnerable spot. If attacked, even if the opponent didn't use much force, it would instantly render him unable to fight. "Bastard!" Janda cursed angrily, immediately kicked the ground with both feet, and leaped backward to try to distance himself from Gellier. But Gellier was not going to give Janda a chance. He quickly chased after him and swung the 8 weapons in his hands at him. There were bursts of noise in the air, and Liang Yu shook her head as she watched from the side. Zhang Yi understood that in the eyes of this martial arts master, the 2 men's fighting had no technique whatsoever. They were relying entirely on brute force and some combat techniques they had learned in a short period of time. They were far inferior to Liang Yu, who had undergone systematic training, and even far inferior to Zhang Yi, whom she had trained herself. The battles between enhanced mutants were cruel, but also full of passion. Soon, both of them were covered in wounds. Zhanga's body was covered with wounds left by Gelier's weapons, some deep and some shallow, with steam rising from the wounds and blood flowing down. Every time he was injured, the red light in his eyes grew stronger. However, Gelier was also suffering. His strength was no match for Zhanga's. He was hit hard in the head by Zhanga, and the left side of his face was a bloody mess. He could hardly see anything with his eyes. His chest was also hit hard, and the dent was visible to the naked eye, sinking in a centimeter or two. The battle was bloody and cruel. As mutants of the enhancement type, both of them were extremely powerful in terms of strength and defense, so it was difficult for them to die. The fierce battle lasted for several tens of minutes. Zhanga's body was covered in blood, and 2 broken swords were stuck in him. Gelier was not much better. He coughed up blood from the corner of his mouth, which flowed down his long beard and dripped onto his clothes. Pa Jigsaw saw this and closed his eyes, silently rolling the rosewood prayer beads in his hand. On the other side, La Min Oju was expressionless, but her face seemed a little paler. If they continued fighting, both of them would die. But now, no one could call a halt. Whoever called a halt would be admitting defeat. Zhang Yi watched the bloody battle, hugged his arms, and turned his head slightly to look at Pa Jigsaw, who was praying with his eyes closed. They can't fight anymore. If they continue, they'll both die. What if you call a truce? Pa Jigsaw opened his eyes and hurriedly said, "No. If I call a truce, the Pa Ji family will be disgraced. Zhanga will not accept the humiliation of defeat." Zhang Yi said impatiently, "Will it affect the outcome of the entire battle?" Pa Jigsaw was taken aback. He then realized that at this moment, both Zhanga and Gelier were seriously injured. No matter who won, the next person would die in the following battle. After all, this was a round-robin battle. So even if they admitted defeat in this round, it would not seem to have much effect on the overall outcome of the battle. But if we call a truce and the other side lets that dying guy continue fighting, what if he fights to the death and injures one of our men? Then we will suffer a great loss. Pa Jigsaw gritted his teeth and said with some reluctance. Pa Jigsaw's words made Zhang Yi look sideways. He just remembered that Pa Jigsaw was only acting like a nice old man in front of him, looking harmless. Could someone who was capable of becoming a local tyrant in the southwest region be a kind-hearted and soft-handed person? Do as you wish. I'm just reminding you that mutants like Zhanga are not easy to train. Zhang Yi didn't want to meddle in other people's business. Since Pa Jigsaw didn't care about the lives of his subordinates, Zhang Yi cared even less. Pa Jigsaw also had his own calculations. Training Zhanga had indeed cost him a lot of resources. But if he lost this battle, the consequences would be even more unbearable. However, suddenly, Pa Jigsaw thought of something. He was so preoccupied with winning that he forgot that if they lost this time, Zhang Yi would also be in a difficult position. Therefore, Zhang Yi must have been completely confident to say that. If that was the case. Pa Jigsaw's eyes darted around, and he suddenly sighed. "You're right, I can't be so selfish. Zhanga is my precious subordinate, I have to protect his life." On the battlefield, Zhanga and Gelier were already fighting fiercely, both of them exhausted and on the verge of death. Just at that moment, Pa Jigsaw suddenly used a megaphone to shout loudly, "Stop, stop. Stop fighting. This battle is lost for the Pa Ji family." These words spread throughout the battlefield, and everyone was shocked. They did not expect Pa Jigsaw to admit defeat when the outcome was still uncertain. Deji and the others were astonished. Has Pa Jigsaw gone mad? He's handing victory to his enemy? They couldn't understand Pa Jigsaw's actions. Not to mention them, even the 2 people on the battlefield couldn't understand. Although Gelier was surprised, he was also relieved. He immediately retreated and stopped fighting desperately. The outcome had already been decided, and he wanted to conserve his strength. If possible, his master would let him retreat, and he would still be able to save his life. He wasn't afraid of death, but that didn't mean he wanted to die. Janda stood there in a daze, tears streaming down his cheeks. He turned back and shouted angrily at Pa Jigsaw, "No! Master, I can die in battle, but I will never admit defeat." Pa Jigsaw said loudly, "Janda, you have not lost. But I, Pa Jigsaw, will not sacrifice my most loyal right-hand man for the sake of a victory." These words gave Janda enough face. He knew that for the men of the snowy region, it was better to die than to become a laughingstock. Sure enough, Janda's heart softened a little. What followed was endless emotion. "You shouldn't have done this for someone like me." Janda knelt on the ground and wept bitterly, his tears melting the snow and ice beneath him. Pa Jigsaw ordered someone to go and treat Janda, and comforted him. However, he still said cautiously to Zhang Yi, "Your Excellency, we lost the first battle." "The next battle?" Zhang Yi glanced at him and said, "You can rest assured. We can't lose." Of course they couldn't lose. Zhang Yi had a surefire method. Pa Jigsaw finally breathed a sigh of relief. Although he didn't know where Zhang Yi got such confidence, he believed that Zhang Yi would send his strongest men to fight. The first round ended with Pa Jigsaw admitting defeat. A burst of excited shouts came from the camp of the three allied armies. This greatly boosted their morale. On the Pa Ji side, the atmosphere was somewhat oppressive. Pa Jigsaw looked at his personal guard, Salangei. He was the Pa Ji family's greatest warrior and strongest fighter, and he was almost always by Pa Jigsaw's side. Even when he slept in the room next to Pa Jigsaw's. "Salangei, it's your turn." Pa Jigsaw glanced at Zhang Yi and said to him, "Do your best, but if you can't win, surrender. We have someone powerful to back us up." Salangei hesitated for a moment. He didn't want to become a laughingstock, and he would rather die in battle. However, he was very important to the Pa Ji family, and if a mutant like him died in battle, it would be a heavy blow to the Pa Ji family. For the sake of the greater good, he couldn't die. As Pa Jigsaw's personal guard, Salangei was not a reckless man, but very intelligent. So he nodded and said, "Yes, family head, I will remember your orders." On the other side, after Gellier won, he turned his head and looked into the distance. He was looking at his family head, La Men Oju. Winning this battle was extremely difficult for him, and now he was almost exhausted. If he continued to fight, he would certainly not survive. La Men Oju looked at Deji beside him. "Chief Monk, my men have won a round. Shouldn't we change people?" "Change people? La Men, don't you understand the rules of a round-robin battle?" Before Deji could respond, Xiaja Gyatso on the other side laughed coldly. "In a life-and-death battle, only cowards leave the battlefield. True warriors fight to the end and die with honor. Now that the women of the La Men family are in charge, have all the men of the La Men family become cowards?" Xiaja Gyatso certainly did not want Gellier to retreat. Because the next person to enter the arena was someone from the Xiaja family. He would rather let Gellier die than let an opponent fight to the death without revealing some of his techniques, and it would be even better if he could inflict serious injuries on his opponent. "Nonsense. Xiaja Gyatso, you'd better take back what you said." La Men Oju glared fiercely at Xiaja Gyatso. But Xiaja Gyatso didn't care at all and said with a cold smile, "Those who enter the arena must fight to the death and cannot leave halfway." He looked at Deji and said, "Otherwise, if we lose this battle, how can we save the face of our three families in Sangha Temple?" Deji glanced indifferently at La Men Oju, his eyes filled with a look that could not be resisted. "La Men, let that warrior fight like a man and fight to the end." La Men Oju suppressed the anger in her heart and clenched her fists. But in the end, she could only grit her teeth and say, "Fine." Gellier did not wait for the order to withdraw. Although he knew in his heart that this would be the outcome, he still had a glimmer of hope. But he was also helpless in the face of this outcome. "If I must die in battle, then death it is." Gellier slowly closed his eyes, placed his hands together in front of his chest, and prayed to Buddha, hoping that after his death, he would enter the Western paradise. Then, he opened his eyes, and a look of determination appeared in them. Soon, Salangei appeared on the battlefield. In his hand, he held a golden Vajra staff, nearly as tall as a person, bronze in color, shaped like a long stick, but with a sharp, conical tip. Salangei walked onto the battlefield, looked at Gellier, who was determined to die, and slowly and firmly raised his left palm to his chest. "Gellier, I'm here to send you on your way." Salangei held the Vajra rod in his hand, staring at Gellier with an expression devoid of joy or sorrow, only filled with a cold, murderous intent. Swish! He swung the rod, his body transforming into a bolt of lightning, suddenly charging toward Gellier. A fierce storm formed behind him, sweeping up a mighty gale due to his incredible speed. Gellier stood tall, his 8 arms wielding weapons, his teeth clenched, determined to risk his life to test Salangei's true strength and even deal him a severe blow. In the blink of an eye, Salangei had closed the distance to Gellier. The Vajra rod came crashing down. Bang! Gellier's 2 Vajra pestles blocked the blow, but they were sent flying by Salangei's force, and blood flowed from his palms. The staff pierced through his arm and landed directly on Gellier's shoulder. With just one blow, the left side of Gellier's shoulder was shattered, and one arm hung limply down. Salangei, an enhancement mutant with the ability code, ascetic and an ability index of 9,800 points. He was similar to Liangyu, both being the purest form of enhanced mutants. After mutation, they only strengthened their basic physical qualities and still chose to fight in human form and with human abilities. In the past, Salangei was the enforcer of the Paji family. He only believed in the Vajra rod in his hands, which he considered a symbol of power. Therefore, he did not bother to become a giant or acquire flashy supernatural abilities to make himself stronger. He believed that doing so was merely a way to hide his inherent weakness and interfere. After transforming, Gellier's 8-armed Vajra was 5 or 6 times larger than Salangei, who looked like a fragile infant in his presence. However, his attack directly sent Gellier into critical condition. Gellier, who was already severely injured, was now even more incapable of fighting Salangei. Although he had 8 arms, they were powerless against Salangei's single Vajra rod. Salangei didn't say a word. Every time he swung his Vajra rod, it would stir up a huge gust of wind, and the buzzing sound was as piercing as a fighter jet flying overhead. The fierce wind was so strong that it even made Gellier's feet unsteady. Even facing a seriously injured opponent, Salangei did not let up or hold back in the slightest. He knew that this battle was far from over. Next, he still had to face 2 more opponents from the enemy side. Puff! 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 Salangei dodged nimbly around Gellier's body, far surpassing the badly wounded Gellier in both speed and strength. With one blow, he broke Gellier's knee. The huge body crashed to the ground, and the next blow was like a divine judgment, smashing towards Gellier's head. Gellier blocked with his right arm, and with a crack, his arm was instantly crushed, half of his arm flying out, blood spurting everywhere. Salangei coldly reversed the golden staff in his hand and stabbed directly at Gellier's head with the spiked end. Pfft! The Vajra rod pierced through Gellier's teeth and finally pierced his throat, blood flowing down the Vajra rod. But at the same time, Gellier desperately wrapped his arms around Salangei in front of him. Roar! Gellier let out a scream that didn't sound human at all with his broken throat. His arms swelled up like balloons, and then he used all the strength he had left to lock Salangei in place. When a person is on the verge of death, they can unleash strength beyond their limits. Salangei's face turned white in an instant. Even with his enhancement, he felt as if he were being held in a vice, with enormous force squeezing his body and distorting his internal organs. Ah! Salangei also fought fiercely, using all his strength in his Vajra rod, which pierced through Gellier's skull with a poochie sound and came out from the back of his head. Gellier was finally dead. Salangei let out a wah sound as blood spurted from his mouth. This scene caused Pa Jigsawn's pupils to contract sharply. This is bad. The thing he feared most had happened. Although Gellier was already dead, the strength he had unleashed in his final moments had still injured Salangei. Enhancement mutant had the strongest vitality, and such situations were not uncommon. Therefore, when fighting them, one could not afford to be the slightest bit careless. At present, Salangei was injured, and even though his injuries were not too serious, there was still a fierce battle ahead. It was clear that even before the battle had begun, Salangei was already at a disadvantage. On the other hand, everyone on the side of the three allied armies was smiling. The second member of the Paji family's mutant was also injured, so it seemed that the next battle was a sure win. La Minoja looked at the dead Gellier with a hint of sadness in her heart, but her face showed no emotion as she straightened her back. This is how the sons of the La Min family should be. Xiaja Gyatso smiled and said, "Now it's time for the warriors of the Xiaja family to take the stage." Xiaja Gyatso waved behind him, and a fat, bald, burly man slowly walked over. With every step he took, the people around him could clearly feel the ground tremble. This was a man weighing over 400 pounds, like a giant Maitreya Buddha, his face shiny with oil, but his eyes showed no trace of the Buddha's compassion, only fierce malice. "Luosang, next up, you." Luosang nodded and bowed. "Head of the family, chief monk, I will definitely win this battle." With that, he turned and left with a series of loud bangs. On the Paji side, everyone was even more anxious. Salangei was injured, and his injuries were not minor. If they lost the next fight, wouldn't they be finished? No wonder they were so worried. If Salangei, with an ability index of 9,800, had failed, the next person would have to face two opponents. They couldn't help but doubt that even if the masters of these families were powerful, unless they were Epsilon, how could they possibly defeat their opponents? What's more, the Yashilangtai family must have even more terrifying tricks up their sleeves. Salangei's injury made Pa Jigsawn's heart leap into his throat. He looked at Zhang Yi with a somewhat resentful gaze, as if to say, "See, I told you not to be so soft-hearted. What are we going to do now?" He also knew that if the Paji family really lost this time, Zhang Yi would never stand up and let them punish him. However, if things came to a breaking point, it would be ugly, and Zhang Yi would also be exposed prematurely. He was still unaware that Zhang Yi had already made contact with the Undertaker. "Honored guest, are you really confident that we can win?" Pa Jigsaw asked again, still feeling uneasy. Zhang Yi said indifferently, "Just relax and put your mind at ease. I told you, we can't lose." When Zhang Yi said this, even Liang Yu couldn't help but glance at him. To be honest, Liang Yu was very confident in her own abilities. But she wasn't invincible either. There were countless skilled fighters in the world, with talented individuals everywhere. She couldn't guarantee victory. Where did Zhang Yi get his confidence from? Zhang Yi didn't say much and just told Pa Jigsaw to watch the show. At this point, Pa Jigsaw had no choice but to trust Zhang Yi. So, in the battle that followed, even though Salangei was seriously injured, he had to grit his teeth and fight on. On the other side, Xiaja didn't rush onto the battlefield. He arrived in front of the battlefield, where the Xiaja family had prepared an empty space for him, and several burly men were carrying a large vat and placing it there. Everyone stared at Luosang, wondering what this guy was up to. Luosang was one of the most important fighters of the Xiaja clan. The other clans didn't know much about him because, as a fighter with deep roots, he rarely fought with others. Even when he did fight, there were very few people in the snowy plateau who could force him to use his full strength. At this moment, Luosang took off his shirt, revealing his fat body, and sat cross-legged on the cold snow. Immediately, a soldier opened the large vat and used ladles to scoop out yellow, clear liquid, pouring it over Luosang's body. "What is that? Is it some kind of tantra ritual?" Fatty Sue opened his binoculars and watched the scene in amazement. He's so fat, and he's still eating like that? He should take better care of his health. He's not as good as me. Fatty Sue saw someone fatter than him and looked proud, as if to say that he wasn't fat at all compared to this person. Pa Jigsaw said seriously, "It's oil. He's pouring butter on himself." Hearing this, Zhang Yi and the others were a little surprised. What's he doing? Is he planning to barbecue himself? Is he that sincere? Pa Jigsaw took a deep breath and said to everyone, Luosang's ability is fire. Fire? Zhang Yi was a bit surprised to hear this ability. It had been too long since he had seen a mutant with the ability to control fire. After the Ice Age, the environment was cold and frozen, which naturally suppressed mutants with fire abilities. Of course, some special fire abilities were exceptions. For example, Jian Han's magnificent ice. Or Xiao Holian's ability to breathe fire. The black flames that Zhang Yi had disguised himself with were actually the power of the void. This was easy to explain because flames were too easily extinguished by ice and snow, and their release would absorb a large amount of heat from the ice and snow in the environment. However, this does not mean that flame abilities are weak. Burning is one of the earliest forms of energy mastered by humans, and our admiration for flames is engraved in our bones. When used properly, this power can still cause extremely terrifying destruction. I wonder how that fat guy Luosang will fight. Luosang sat cross-legged on the snow, allowing ladle after ladle of butter to pour over his body. His thick skin seemed to breathe, wrapping the thick butter into the layers of his flesh. In no time, he was covered in orange-yellow butter, looking sticky and resembling an ancient Buddha statue. When Zhang Yi saw this, he thought of Xiao Holian, the head of the Yangsheng base in Tianhai City. Using external substances? When Xiao Holian used her supernatural abilities, she would also use high-concentration alcohol or gasoline. It seemed that this fat man's ability was similar to Xiao Holian's. Sure enough, what happened next confirmed Zhang Yi's guess. A third of the giant cylinder of butter was poured onto Luosang's body. When he was completely covered in butter, he slowly stood up, raised the cylinder of butter with both hands, and then poured it into his own mouth. Sure enough, it's just as I imagined. Zhang Yi thought to himself and mentioned it to Pa Jigsaw. Although it was just a small piece of information, Pa Jigsaw dared not take it lightly and hurriedly informed Salangei. Upon hearing this, Salangei frowned slightly. He held the Vajra rod in his hand, thought for a moment, looked at the entire battlefield, then looked at the ground beneath his feet, and came up with an idea. At this moment, Luosang, who was ready, finally arrived at the battlefield. This was not a competition, so there was no need for anyone to shout start. Once they stepped onto the battlefield, one of them had to fall. Luosang's huge body was covered in sticky butter. He touched his bald head and suddenly opened his mouth wide, at an angle unimaginable to humans, like the mouth of a wolf or a tiger. Ha! A piercing roar accompanied by a strong wind blew across the snowy plain. The wind swept past Salangei, and his expression immediately turned ugly. He has bad breath. People from both sides were speechless. Although what Salangei said was most likely true, was it really appropriate to say that in such a serious situation where life and death were at stake? Ah! Luosang suddenly slapped his stomach and laughed loudly. As he laughed, his body suddenly burst into flames with a boom. However, the flames were not ordinary yellow, but golden. Behind him, a golden halo of flames rose. He laughed loudly, patting his stomach, with golden light shining behind him, truly resembling the legendary Maitreya Buddha. Luosang, the #1 warrior of the Xiaja clan, a trait system ability user, ability code name Buddha Light Maitreya, ability index, 9,700 points. Luosang suddenly used his fat arms to support himself on the ground, his entire body resembling a huge bag of meat. A golden flame spurted from his mouth, splitting in the middle and rushing toward the battlefield on both sides. Salangei responded to the ever-changing situation with an unchanging expression, coldly watching Luosang's moves. A few seconds later, the entire battlefield was engulfed in blazing flames, forming a circle with a radius of about 1 kilometer and flames nearly 2 meters high. In the next instant, Luosang dropped to all fours, his once obese body now as agile as a cheetah, charging towards Salangei like a bullet. Salangei planted his feet firmly in the snow, his right hand clenching the golden Vajra staff. Luosang charged towards Salangei, his body burning in midair like a huge fireball. As he charged forward, the flames grew more and more intense. Gradually, the fireball grew to a diameter of 4 or 5 meters. Facing this attack, Salangei did not take it lightly, but chose to dodge cautiously. The fireball, however, charged forward once more and quickly rushed toward Salangei. Its speed was increasing. Rolling friction was minimal, so there was nothing that could be done. Whoosh!